this episode, we talk to Dr. Nick Gordon about Piet Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie. This late work has the essential linearity that we expect of the artist, but it has a very different feel. As we'll hear, it represents a significant moment of cultural contact in 1940s Manhattan. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Kathleen.
What object have you chosen for us to talk about today?
Well, today I've chosen Piet Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie from the early 1940s.
And where would we find this work if we wanted to look at it in person?
Today this work is part of MoMA's collection in New York.
And for people who are listening along, this is a bit of a challenge, but can you describe this artwork for us, please?
I can. So if you think of what we typically think of as a Mondrian, where we've got quite a simple but very precise arrangement of black lines and then squares and rectangles of a couple of different colours. If we have that, we call that to mind, and then we take that across the North Atlantic to New York, and you inject it with the energy of a modern city. The buzz of being in New York, the energy that comes through with jazz and boogie in the 1940s. And you see how that might start to destabilize that idea of what we have of Mondrian. And we have here instead something that is still made of just lines and colored squares and rectangles, but it has a sense of movement and energy about it. And incidentally, there are no black lines in this one. They're all yellow, blue, or red. It's just primary colours. Some of these are arranged like narrow streets, so you kind of get these long vertical and horizontal strips crisscrossing it, whereas in amongst those there are other bits, other sections which are larger squares and rectangles, and some of those rectangles are inside other rectangles. So it's a work that when we look at, we can see where Mondrian has come from, but we can see where he's gone to, at the end of his life, and the influence of New World modernism, a different way of living life, which he gets in the 1940s.
So the big white patches that I see here, are they the canvas itself? This is an oil painting on canvas?
The big white patches are painted as well.
So then in terms of what I'm looking at a kind of a grid-like arrangement of white, red, yellow, and blue. Really strongly geometric. As you said, that is what I would tend to think of when I think of Mondrian, is that really rigidly geometric approach. Where does this work fall in his career?
So this is very much towards the end of his career. So he had left Europe, left the Netherlands in 1940 during World War II, and he'd escaped to the US. Along with kind of, as you may know, just numerous other artists and architects and other people as well. If they could get out, they did. So he's then living in New York for a couple of years. And this is kind of in that last section, I suppose, that last handful of works that he creates. So it's at the very end of his career as an artist. It's
quite difficult, I think, to look at a work like this one and not try and find some kind of visual analogy in your head when you think about it, from Manhattan street grid to musical notation to a computer game from the 1980s, Pac-Man or something. It's very hard to resist that urge to look at this and resolve it into some recognizable collection of objects. How did Mondrian see works such as this one?
It's a really, really good question. So Mondrian saw his work as, I suppose, as a way of reducing the visual field down into its essential elements. And in this respect, he's actually quite classicizing. So he's thinking of, well, the visual world in terms of painting and art making is made up of line and color. Which reflects the Renaissance tradition. But his underlying sense of the proportion, how you arrange things, is using other structures, other proportional relationships, the golden ratio, R2 and R3 rectangles, which are used in Gothic architecture, And he's aware of all of these traditions in Western painting, in Western art. And he's trying to reduce those down to their bare elements. And then from that, create a new type of art that reflects the modern world. So moving away from direct representation towards these are the principles on which our civilization is built. And let's build an art that represents a new modern civilization growing from those same principles.
The title Broadway Boogie Woogie suggests that music and the rhythm of music is important here, and presumably that has a kind of a role to play in the placement of the squares and rectangles on the visual grid that I'm looking at. It feels like there's a tension between the kind of improvisation of jazz and really extraordinarily careful placement of objects. Do you think that is that a tension, or is it a false kind of distinction?
No, I think that is a tension. And I suppose it's a kind of, we know that Mondrian did love boogie woogie and jazz and blues, which are all ultimately American, primarily African American forms. And I think what he's doing here is he's bringing some of that different, some of that kind of, I suppose, that new world energy, that dynamism into his work. So we kind of, I think, are getting that somehow in the way, it's almost like you get a bouncing between the little coloured sections and those lines. But you're also looking at this work, you get a sense of if you're an aerial view looking down on the streetscape of New York. I remember talking about this with a group in an art appreciation class, and people were looking down on this and saying, well, actually, those little squares inside those big squares are kind of like the water things on top of the buildings in Manhattan. So you get a sense of buildings, of streetscapes, of the play of light in a city at night, as well as kind of that energy of the music, of kind of a musical energy coming through as well.
I suppose in order to be able to improvise and to create a rhythm that is a little unexpected, a little surprising, you have to base yourself on a really firm knowledge of classical form, that kind of description of needing to know the rules before you can go ahead and break them in a way that is still somehow coherent. What do you think is going on visually here in terms of breaking the rules but keeping them coherent? Is this painting evoking a particular mood, do you think?
Yes. I think partly the mood that it's evoking, though, is a sense among kind of old world Europeans of, I suppose, a realization that kind of the new world is different. So the sorts of urban forms, the sorts of urbanism that he's capturing here, the kind of Manhattan of the 1940s, is completely foreign to Europeans. They just do not have that form of urbanism, and most places in Europe today still don't have that form of urbanism. So I think you've got a sense here of an awakening. That America is a place that does more than supply, bombs and tanks. That it has its own kind of new vibrant culture, and I think you're getting a sense of that kind of that new interest of Mondrian, I suppose, falling in love with this new vibrant culture, this new dynamism that he's finding in New York, and he's finding a way of capturing that. And that, on the one hand, he's still using this visual language that he has created for himself, which is an extension of a classical, I suppose, a classicizing tradition. But then he's also breaking some of his own rules because those rules don't quite work with the experience he's having in New York. So, for example, here, you'll notice that none of these squares are contained by a black line. It's just color. There's no black in the work at all.
So did this work find favor in New York, this style that he's working with after he moves to New York? Did it find favor? Did people buy these works? Did they begin to be collected by institutions reasonably quickly, or was there a period of reassessment of what he was doing?
No, he was reasonably successful when he was in the US. He already had an established reputation European avant-gardism, in New York at least, it was well established since the 19 teens with things like the Armory Show. There was kind of an interest amongst not only, I suppose, migrant Europeans, but also kind of Americans in New York in kind of these new weird things that are coming out of Europe. So that interest, I think, is mutual. And yes, his works were being collected by bought by both fellow artists who are part of the New York art scene. They're being bought by major patrons in New York as well. So he doesn't have to go to New York to make himself. He's towards the later stage of having a very long established career. So he arrives as a famous artist and is able to sell his work.
And as a piece that you've chosen for us to talk about, you clearly think it's a significant one. So how would you sum up for us, in conclusion, the importance of this work in 20th century art?
I think it's mostly significant. Firstly, just because it's a little bit in some ways very different from his earlier style. And I think that it's significant because it represents this moment of, I suppose, cultural contacts, this kind of what's going on in New York in the 1940s, where you've kind of got different styles, different cultures, different people kind of getting their heads around each other in one moment. And it's in this culture that is bubbling away in New York that kind of this is where you'll start seeing people like Pollock, for example, coming out of. This is where you'll see the New York school coming out of in the 1950s. And it's this cross-pollination, I think, of ideas. But I think it's where we often get given a sense that it's a one-way street. It's Americans taking European things and trying to do something new with them. Whereas I think this shows that goes the other way too. This is a European discovering America and trying to incorporate that into his own art.
Thanks very much, Nick.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.